is Fred Berkey. I'm an extension agent for the University of Florida, IFAS. My territory is Martin County, St. Lucie County, and the city of Stewart. My program is Your Florida Yard, which is an outreach educational program to teach you, the general public, how to take care of your environment and protect it. Today we've got something really, really special. This will probably be my last TV program with MCTV. And as you can see, we're on a boat. And we're going to take a little boat trip. And we're going to tour the Indian River Lagoon and the estuary. And actually what we're going to call this is Living on the Lagoon. So just bear with us. We're going to take this trip and we're going to have a really, really good time and meet some wonderful, wonderful people. This is Captain Nancy Beaver, and I think we're going to go different places today, Captain Nance.
Yes, we are.
And you're going to show us some different things. What can you tell us about where we are right here?
Well, as you said, we're at the base of the St. Lucie. Manatee Pocket is right over here, and the inlet is right out here. So it's a wonderful place to look at where the water comes together when we have these incoming and outgoing tides. And we'll look around. You can really see the difference in the color of the water. When we're getting an outgoing tide, it doesn't look real good coming down the St. Lucie River, and then the water is pristine coming in off the ocean.
We're going to take a little trip, so let's just get going. All right, Captain Nance, let's see sort of our bearings here. I'm looking at Sewell's Point over here to my left, about halfway down. Mm-hmm. And now we're on the Indian River, which is on the opposite side of where we were.
Yes.
And we're actually in front of something that's been very popular, and really it's been around for many, many years. Tell us a little bit about this behind us, and about this, as they call it, Bird Island.
They call it Bird Island.
Well,
I guess we can see why, huh?
Yeah.
But it is a very special place. It's one of the spoil islands, and we don't know why the birds picked that island. What we do know is once it gets established by some good numbers, usually it's good numbers of egrets that establishes a rookery,
right,
then it becomes a lot more attractive for everybody else, all the rest of the colony nesters.
Well, here we are. We have come to what we call Boy Scout Island, I believe. And we're actually on the Indian River, correct?
Yep.
In the lagoon. And we've come here for a special reason. This is Mark Perry right here. And actually everybody knows Mark. He is the executive director of Florida Oceanographic. And I want to tell you, he's a pretty special guy. And I can definitely say he is Martin County's most influential and respected advocate of our local estuary and lagoon. And this is Vincent, Dr. Vincent Encomio. I'm awful sorry. And Vincent is the senior scientist and director of scientific research at the Florida Oceanographic Society. Actually, what he is really in charge of most of the oyster research, I believe. And of course of rebuilding our habitats for oysters. But Mark, really what I want you to tell us about is this is actually a spoil island.
Right.
How did that come about? Why do they call them spoil islands? And even more so, tell us a little bit about the lagoon. I mean, actually, people think that this is the, quote, Indian River, but is definitely not a river.
Right.
So tell us the difference and how the spoil islands developed, and just a little bit about the area.
Sure. Well, the Indian River Lagoon, as you know, goes from Ponce Inlet north of Cape Canaveral all the way down south to Jupiter Inlet. And that's 152 mile long, and it's about a mile wide like it is here, right on an average. And it's very shallow lagoon. It's only about 3 feet deep on
I'll
average.
be darned, yeah.
So it allows the sunlight to penetrate the lagoon and grow this great habitat we call seagrasses, that grow in the sunlight, and they got great nutrients. So this is a great spot, but in boat traffic needed to go up and down the lagoon, they needed to dredge a channel.
Right.
So they dredged the intercoastal waterway way back when in the 20s and 30s. And what that did was dredge the channel. They needed to spoil the material from the dredging of the channel onto these islands. So they made these spoil islands of the spoil from the dredging. And each island was a little bit bigger, different, and they started to vegetate with mangroves and grasses and other native vegetation, and including exotic vegetation like Australian pines and all that. So what happened is these islands became great sites for recreation, for conservation. Across from us is a bird rookery that's restricted, so it's just for bird nesting. And so each of these spoil islands is a little bit different. But all around the islands are the seagrass habitat and things like that. So people who use them need to take care and make sure that they don't, destroy any of the vegetation. But that's how spoil islands got their name.
Well, that's pretty fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to pick on you now. Dr. Encomio.
Encomio.
Got it right. Anyway, tell us a little bit about, now he talked about seagrasses, and this is one of the areas where it was really a little bit prolific. I can remember when I was growing up, it was so bad, or not so bad, but it was so good that you could walk through and seine it and get all these different little animals and critters. Tell us a little about the seagrasses of the area.
Well, the Indian River Lagoon is unique in that it supports the highest seagrass diversity in the continental U.S. Up to 7 species of seagrass are found right here in the Indian River Lagoon.
Well, I'll be darned, really. Yeah.
And one of those is actually on the endangered species list. Johnson seagrass is classified as threatened under endangered species list,
Right.
which makes it, I think, the only species, a seagrass species, on the endangered species list. And it's really only found here in the Indian River Lagoon, and maybe a little bit further south than that, but it's got a very narrow range.
Now, I noticed that we were looking around farther, and there isn't too much here now. What's really happened?
Well, over the years, we have had events where we've lost seagrass. Down in our area, freshwater discharges can have a very adverse impact on
Sure.
seagrasses. And so we've had die-offs due to that. In the North and Central Lagoon, we've had die-offs in recent years due to brown tides and very high algae blooms.
Yeah. Now, I understand that you're actually doing some research on actually trying to renovate or put some of this back into the lagoon its area. Are you doing that at FOS?
Yes, what we are doing is we are trying to restore seagrass species in this area of the Indian River Lagoon. And the way we're doing that is we're actually collecting uprooted seagrass fragments.
Okay.
There's what we found over the past few years is actually there's a significant amount of material that we can collect that would otherwise die because it's in the rack line. So we collect that and then we replant that in a seagrass nursery at our coastal center. And then we're raising those to be able to plant them back in the lagoon itself.
Oh, that's pretty fantastic. I think what we're going to do now is let's just go over to your facility. Well, here we are, back of your establishment here. This is Florida Oceanographic Society.
Yep.
And Mark, I want you to give us a little bit of the history, what went on. I can remember years and years ago, knowing you back then, you had this vision,
Oh, yeah.
this little sparkle in your eye, and boy, oh boy, it really came true. And just tell us a little bit about how it started, what it is, and what's going on.
Well, Fred, in 1964, Florida Oceanographic Society was established right here in Stewart, but we were over on Kruger Creek in the St. Lucie River.
Oh, I remember
And
that.
the old estate, James Rand Estate. He
Right.
gave it to the Oceanographic, set it up, and my father, Cliff Perry, was one of the original board members. along with 4 other community leaders. And they set up the Oceanographic Society. And I remember as a young kid just helping them catch sharks and different experiments. They had visiting scientists from Woods Hole and Cornell Medical, other places. And I never thought that when I came back in 1978 to Stewart, it was still going, but they were getting ready to dissolve the organization. So we got it back going again, and we needed a new place because that's surrounded by residential area
Sure.
down in Stewart,
Yeah,
as you know.
yeah.
So we looked around South Florida, and sure enough, right here in Martin County, they had no plans for this side of the Stewart Beach. It goes from Ocean A1A to the river. So we asked for a coastal center. We proposed this coastal center be open to the public, and they gave us a 99-year lease in 1985 for this coastal center. So we went to work getting nature trails put in and building aquariums and building all the facilities we have now. So we have about 60,000 visitors a year that come through the coastal center. They learn all about the game fish lagoon, and they learn all about the coastal ecosystems of our area. So right down here next to the Indian River Lagoon, we have an ideal spot to do all of our kind of oyster restoration, all of our different types of research
Right,
and work,
right.
and even do seining trips during the summer right out here in the seagrass beds that are right offshore.
You know, it's pretty doggone fantastic. You know,
Well,
we have
it
this beautiful facility right here in Martin County, probably one of the premier facilities in the state, if not the nation. We'll say that.
Everybody should come and
Yeah,
visit.
I think so.
Check
I
it
really
out.
agree. And now, Vincent, you're sort of, one thing about it though is you're doing research as well as education. In other words, you do research
Yep.
that's going to continue this and sort of improve everything that we need to know about the river and everything else. And of course, we have found out the importance of oysters. And Doc, you're the one that's really started in this. You're sort of into the, what it is, oyster restoration reef. What do you call it?
Actually, the name of our program is FLOR, which stands for Florida Oceanographic Oyster Restoration. And it encompasses a number of different programs. We're actually right here in the back of our coastal center. This is the area where we collect oyster shell. We collect oyster shell from about 10 different restaurants and
Really?
an annual seafood festival, the Port Salerno Seafood Festival.
Right.
And we were basically taking that shell and putting it back in the water. Because if we don't do that, all that oyster shell is going to get thrown in the waste. It's going to end up in a landfill.
Well, why do you use the shells? I don't understand that quite exactly.
The shells is extremely important because when we put the shell out in the water, we're basically creating new substrate for baby oysters to settle and attach to. And once they do, and they prefer to settle on other oysters. So by putting the shell back in the water, we're replenishing that supply of shell and not only able to restore reefs, but create new reefs in new areas.
So literally what you're doing is in areas where you think that they will develop and where they're needed, you put these shells out there.
Yes.
Now, is this all these bags that I see here that
Yes.
smell so good?
Well, yeah, we store the shell here after we collect it from the restaurant for a few months.
Right.
And that's to get rid of that smell and get rid of all the bacteria
stuff that's on it.
and potential pathogens that might come with shell from different areas of the country. And then what we do is we take that oyster shell, we package them into bags, and these bags act as the building block for new oyster
All the
reefs.
oysters.
Oh, I see. So
seven.
all of these, so the larva that's already in the river
Yes.
come and attach to the different oysters, and so this is what's building your reef.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Becomes
Yes.
a living reef.
Right.
Right, becomes a living reef. And that's true. We do rely on a natural supply of oyster larvae
Right.
from natural populations, but in locations where we're not sure if there's enough larval supply to get to those reefs,
I see.
we actually use aquaculture technology. We have a shellfish hatchery right here on the premises where we can spawn oysters, raise them through the larval stage, and introduce the larvae to these bags of shell. And actually, it's called remote setting, and we set the larvae on the shell
So you're
directly in
taking
the hatchery.
something similar to this. Of course, we're going to talk about this
Right.
because we're highly involved in what they call oyster gardening.
Yes.
And we're going to show the people across the river what you're doing. But actually, essentially, it's the same thing. You're taking a bag of oysters or a facility with oyster shells in it, and then you're creating the larva in a big tank?
Yes. Yes.
Spawn.
We
And
raise
then
the larvae.
You spawn the larvae,
Millions at a time.
and then they become spats
They're ready
think-
to settle.
Once they settle and attach to a substrate, such
Right,
as this oyster shell,
right.
then they begin their lives as an oyster as we know it. When you see an oyster on your dinner plate, it starts out after settlement just a few millimeters long and eventually grows to these sizes. But once it settles and attaches to the shell, then it's known as a spat.
A spat. And really a spat is nothing more than a little tiny mark, right? Like the end of a pen or a...
It can be as when it first settles down, it can be as small as a pinpoint.
Now I know you brought something that just amazed me. Show your prop of the different sizes of oysters. And
Sure. Well, when we collect oysters from the environment, they're typically around this size. The legal size for oyster harvesting is about 3 inches, and that's
Okay.
generally across the nation. So we pick up oyster shells about this size,
Right.
but that's not as, oysters can get much bigger than that. And I'm gonna show you right here, they can get as big as this. This is an
Holy
eastern
cow.
oyster, same species, and they can even get bigger than this. This is this shell, we use this in demonstrations because it's significant, and because it was collected from right here in our St. Lucie River at the
Really?
Roosevelt Bridge in the 1930s.
Wow.
And this gives you an idea of just how big oysters could get.
I don't know that I'd even want to open that
That's
baby.
a whole
Right.
dinner right there.
That's
Fred.
a
This
whole-
is one-
It'd almost eat you, you know?
Right, this is one po' boy. But this is kind of, we use this as an example as to what we'd love to achieve
Right,
down the
right.
line.
And you got both sides of it, right?
Right.
Good.
So you've
Oh,
got,
look
Yeah,
at that.
look at that
Yeah.
size of that
That's
shell.
fantastic.
Wow.
Well, is there anything else you want us to know about oyster restoration, about what's going on?
well, the other thing that I'd like to add about an oyster restoration program, it's what we call a community-based restoration program. And when I say community, I mean everybody in the public, volunteers. And that really is what drives our program.
Right.
When we have events where we bag the shell, we put a call out to volunteers, and
Right.
when we build the reefs, the same
build
thing. We'll have dozens, if not sometimes even up to 100 volunteers will come and help us build these reefs.
That's fantastic. You know, Mark, you might sort of end this phase of it. Just tell us how important oysters are to environment. I was so amazed
Yeah.
at how important they are and significant they are as to really telling us what
Yeah.
the actual attitude and what the river is doing.
Well, as you know, Fred, the Indian River Lagoon right here is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in North America.
Right.
And we have over 4,300 species of little plants
Wow.
and animals.
Yeah.
But those species, 300 little species of crabs and shrimp and larvae, depend on oyster reefs. So these reefs that we start putting out there, living reefs with living oysters, become the habitat for little tiny crabs and shrimp and some of those are larval stages of big
Right.
fish. So they're very important for producing reef habitat. And the other thing about oysters is they filter water.
Right.
They filter about 50 gallons a day per oyster.
50
And
gallons?
50 gallons a day. So if you put an acre of oyster reefs with over 600,000 oysters in 1 acre, now you're filtering almost 30 million gallons a day
Holy
of filtration. So imagine we had over 400 acres of oyster reefs in the St. Lucie. Imagine how much filtration and cleaning up that was back
Well,
then.
I can certainly see why it's so important
Yeah.
to get this back.
Yeah.
Well, this is really wonderful. What I'd like to do now is that I'm very involved with you with oyster gardening.
Right.
And so we're going to go to another spot, Indian Riverside Park, which is right across the river.
Right across the river.
And you can show us and tell us all about that.
Sure.
All right, well, let's get going. Well, here we are. We made it across the river. We're at Indian Riverside Park, which is one of the premier parks for Martin County. And actually what we're going to do here is we're going to have you, I'm going to start out with you, Vince. Tell us a little bit about oyster gardening. Of course, I'm very much into this because that's what I do and that's what I teach, is gardening. But I know this is quite a bit different, or at least different, than what you're doing for oyster restoration and making reefs. Just tell us about it a little bit.
Sure, Fred. Well, actually, Florida Oceanographic got their start in oyster restoration with oyster gardening. And the idea behind oyster gardening is that you take oysters, baby oysters, grow them in cages off someone's dock, for example, And when they grow to a certain size, then you can place them out on a reef. And in the meantime, while they're growing in those cages, they're filtering water, they're providing small mini habitats for other organisms, the 300 up to the 300 species that Mark mentioned earlier. And so it's a way of promoting oyster restoration, and it's another way of getting the community involved in a different type of oyster restoration.
Well, I know we're working with you on this, and through the university, IFAS, and of course we're using the 4-H group, which are children, or not children, but older children, and they're actually collecting shells and helping you over there. Now, continuing on what we did at the FOS, your facility over there, they have already taken some oysters and they have put them in this tank, which I would call a larva tank.
Yes.
And then the shells get the little spats or spots or whatever they call it. Then we're going to bring them over here, and what are we going to do with them here?
Well, what they've done at FOS is they've taken these cages of oyster shell, and this is a cage of your design, kind of a collaborative design between yourself and FOS and the kids, the 4-H kids. And the idea is that these are going to be small oyster habitats. We're going to seed some of them with oysters from the hatchery, so they'll already have baby oysters on them.
I got you.
And then we're going to suspend them off the dock right here at Indian Riverside Park.
Oh, I see. Now, how long would they have to stay on the dock?
They're going to stay on the dock for about a month. And after a month, we should see them grow from a few millimeters to probably at least dime to nickel sized.
Okay.
And then when they're that size, what we're going to do is take these cages and actually place them inside some of the oyster habitats that we already have right here at the park.
All right, now these are what you call reef balls?
Reef balls, yes. Reef balls are concrete modules that are underwater habitats, artificial reefs, basically miniature artificial reefs that we've placed in the river at several locations in this area. They're also used quite extensively for offshore artificial reefs.
All right, so what, I think I've seen one, and they're really about what, this big around?
That big around.
Right.
I'm assuming.
They're a dome. They're about 2 feet high. They weigh about 100 pounds,
Holy cat.
and they have holes in them so that fish can go in and out.
In and out.
The concrete surfaces provide substrate for settlement of oysters or other fouling organisms like mussels and barnacles.
So then you take this and put it into the top.
Yes.
Almost like a volcano, and then this is the little hole in the top, and you stick this right here that we have created, and it's already got the spats on it,
Right.
and they have become almost nickel or dime sized by this
Right.
time.
Right.
What happens then? Do the oysters just accumulate all over this and the ball?
With the cages is that they'll grow through this mesh, and eventually this mesh will disintegrate. It's chicken wire,
Sure.
and then we'll have a miniature oyster habitat inside of the reef balls.
Oh, I have it. So then it continues out, and then
Right.
it keeps growing on itself.
Mhm. Yep.
Yeah.
You know, the one interesting thing about this, now this is all on Sewell's Point here, and you and I both went to the commission at Sewell's Point,
Yes.
and we told them what we were doing, or you told them mostly. I just tagged along. But anyway, what's interesting is that this could be actually used at these individual dock right in Sewell's Point by residents. Is this correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So people that are interested in oyster gardening or oyster restoration in general, but they're not sure if they want to put a reef in front of their shoreline, they can actually grow oysters in cages off their dock and still contribute to our overall efforts to restore oysters in our
Well, the
river.
beauty of it too is that they don't really have to have any special permits or anything like that.
No, that's the other nice thing about oyster gardening is we don't when we do oyster reef restoration, we have to pursue state and federal permits
Right.
to be able to place structures in the water.
Bottom.
So they would be involved in actually rearing the oysters.
Yes.
And then they're given back to you, and then you, through legal means, put them in the proper places in the Indian River.
Right.
Lagoon.
We would place those oyster habitats at different sites in the river that are permitted for oyster
Right,
reef
correct.
restoration, just like the site right here at Indian Riverside Park. The site here has been the site of a overall living shoreline restoration, It's a project with Martin County, and we've created oyster reefs, planted mangroves and marsh grass on the shoreline, and soon we're going to plant seagrass here as well.
You know, this is such a wonderful concept. The reason I like it so much is that you're involving children. Now we're involving residents and adults and people that already live on the river and want to help create a better environment for our oysters.
Right,
Well,
exactly.
Very, very good. I really appreciate that.
It's really great, Fred, and it also is like building kind of the resilience to all of these damaging discharges and stuff that we get.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's what I want to talk to you next about. We really haven't addressed the real problems that we have here in the river. Just give us a little quick synopsis, because we see it in the paper all the time. But you're the one. You're our spokesman. Just tell us really how bad it is, in the river, and how bad it's getting, and what we can do to correct it.
Well, as you know, anything that runs off of our water into our waterways can be detrimental if it's too much and too bad of a nutrients or high pollution in the water. So a lot of times we've had runoff, especially in the summer months, from rainfall, heavy rain. So all the tidal creeks, they come into they turn a little brown into the water. But what we have is artificially runoff water from our C23, C24, and C44 canals. And as you know, C44 canals connect to Lake Okeechobee. So when Lake Okeechobee gets too high, it was designed back in the 30s to discharge the water to the St. Lucie and Indian River and the Caloosahatchee on the west coast of Fort Myers. Unfortunately, these damaging discharges of huge volumes of polluted water get to the estuary, and they start to kill off the oyster reefs and the seagrass beds. What's nice about this location in Indian Riverside Park is Vincent has built into it the resilience. So once the discharges stop, then these oyster reefs become the seed source for the inside of the estuary. So even though some of the reefs on the inside near Roosevelt Bridge and in the South Fork or North Fork might die back because of those damaging discharges, these reefs out here will become the seed source for those on the inside after to recover. And as you know, of course, eventually we'd like to stop all those artificial discharges into our waterways and allow the estuary to be an estuary to naturally get the tidal flows from
Well,
it.
it's interesting too, and you mentioned that we do have the runoff, and actually this probably is just as bad as the releases from Lake Okeechobee. It's when we had the two combined. So we as residents of Martin County, if we could just take care of our own individual little pieces of property with proper fertilization, all these different things, this could help it quite a bit.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's why a lot of counties have passed fertilizer ordinances to keep the fertilizer away from the watershed and apply it properly and on proper times, and not to have it just run off into the water. And then also the living shorelines and regrowing the grasses or mangroves along the shorelines help to buffer any kind of runoff from the property to help take up the nutrients before it reaches the river.
Tell me a little bit about the sucky disc. Oh no, it's Secchi disc.
Secchi disc, right.
I got it right. Okay.
Yep, it was developed by Angelo Secchi, back in an Italian guy, an oceanographer, back in 1865. And it simply looks like this, about a foot in diameter, and it has a red, black and white panels. And the way you'd use it is you lower it into the water, and as soon as it disappears from your sight above the water, that's the reading you take off of the string, so you know how deep the light penetrates to the water. Of course, the deeper the better. If it goes all the way to the bottom, then that's great for seagrass. But if it's very shallow and it disappears instantly, then you have a lot of turbidity and stuff in the water. So it's not good. But that's a Secchi disc.
Well, that's pretty fantastic. I think what we're going to do now, we have one more stop. We're going to go around the point, and we're going to end up on the other side, on the St. Lucie side, and we're going to visit two good friends of all of us. We've got Dennis Hudson Jr., and he's been here for many, many, many years, and we've got Dale Hipson, Doc Dale, and they have lived here all of their lives.
All of their lives.
And of course, this was their playground back then.
Fantastic.
So we're going to find out from them what it was like back then. So I guess, Captain Nancy, if you're ready to go, we're just going to motor on out. good to see you.
Good to see
Court,
you. Good to see
Good
you.
to see you.
good to
Thank
be
you
here,
for
Fred.
coming. Actually, what we're doing here today is that we've been to other parts of the river, and we've talked to some other people. Mark Perry
Okay.
was one of them.
Good.
And we have learned about the degradation of the river and what's happened to it, maybe even some of the reasons. And really what I brought y'all here for is that you've been here most of your lives, right here in Martin County, and living on the lagoon and the river. We've got this wonderful, wonderful spot on the St. Lucie side, down Sewell's Point, and we'll just talk about the river like it was back when you guys were playing in it. I mean, this was your playground, really. I know
right.
that, and I'm sure you've got some stories to tell. We've talked already about oysters and fishing and the actual muddy parts of the water and the seagrass. So if you could just give us a little bit of an idea what it was like back when you were growing up. I guess we'll start with you, Dale, and you can talk among, and maybe, I'm sure you got some stories. Just tell us the ones that you're allowed to put on camera.
Well, Fred, that limits things
I'm sure it does.
quite a bit. But we did have one of the things I remember was the gill nets that were strung across the river from shore to shore. And they would have a kerosene lantern on a float to mark the net. And then they bring them in every morning, and they were netting mainly for mullet and snook and trout. But that was one of the main things I remember. And croakers.
And croakers,
That's right.
yeah.
But
It went all the way across the river.
right, and there were two parts. There'd be one part on the east side and one part on the west side,
Yeah,
and that's a long stretch.
yeah,
and-
it sure is.
And then they'd bring the nets in the morning. They had what they call a scrapper boat. Earl Dyer told me about this. A guy would come by, he'd pick up their fish, he'd write it down what they had, he would go on to the next boat. There were several, you'd see them all across the river here, 4 or 5 of these big nets.
I'll be darned.
And then he'd go to the fish market in Salerno, sell the fish, get the money, and bring it back to the people that gave him the
Oh,
picked
my
up the fish. So it was quite a production.
Corky, what about you? What can you remember?
Well, to continue Dale's story on the seining fishermen, they would have a towboat, which is pulling about 4 or 5 boats behind it. 3 of those boats would be mullet boats, and they were just open. You might call them rowboats, and they would put the fish in there, which are mostly mullet.
Right.
And that's why they call them mullet boats. Then they had a couple of net boats which carried the big nets. And then there was a boat that had a little engine in it, a little gasoline 1-cylinder engine that had a windlass on it, and that was tied to the top line of the nets,
I got you.
and that would pull the net in. It was such a big net they couldn't pull it in with
By hand.
manpower,
Yeah.
so they had this boat tied to a tree on the beach, and the net went out. It was tied to a tree way down the beach, went almost across the river, came back in a big circle, and they'd tie the winching boat to another tree, and that would pull the nets in, and it would run for probably half hour, maybe an hour.
I'll be darned.
And I was a little kid. I was 6 or 7, and my brother was with me. He was younger than I, and sometimes we'd have the job of pulling the slip knot so that the net would come away
Release it.
from the pull line before the net got entangled with the windlass.
So we're talking about a lot of fish.
Yeah, they would pull them in, and they'd finally bring the net and make it into a pocket, and they
Okay.
would have a mullet boat on each side. There'd be 4 sides to the
Pocket.
to the pocket, and it would be, I guess it went to the bottom,
I'll be
and
darned.
fish would be jumping out, and
Well, obviously they don't have that much fish around here to do that now.
and we would, and the fishermen would then net the fish up and put them in the mullet boats, and in my day they towed them to the fish house themselves
I'll be
and unloaded them.
Yeah,
And I could have all the fish I wanted, and I
yeah,
got the ones I liked, the sheephead and things. And my mother said, "Why don't you bring home a decent fish for us to cook?"
That's funny.
But we ate the
Yeah.
sheephead and everything.
Well, what about some of the other? I mean, did you guys go out and oyster? I mean, and did you use anything in the seagrasses? I remember when I was growing up, we used to seine the seagrass areas. I mean, actually, right along here, and we would get the little seahorses and put them
Yeah.
in jars and stuff. Did you do
lot of-
anything with the oysters or the?
I don't like oysters.
Oh, you were the wrong one to ask.
Yeah, ask Cork.
Well, they did. I personally and my family didn't get into oysters, but a lot of people did in the earlier days than when we came. You'd have to wade out in the river and pull the oysters out of the bottom. And
Like
take
the
them.
clams and
Yeah, and the clams you dug up on the sandbars.
Sure.
And I dug clams on the sandbars. There were sandbars in Palm City, full
Really?
of clams. There were sandbars down towards the inlet, and there were those.
Some at Bessie Creek.
I guess there were
had
cohogs
sandbars. Yeah.
about that big around,
Yeah, yeah.
and we would pull them. And my young son Andrew, when he was about 8 or 10, he took my aqua sport, and he
Yeah.
discovered clams, which was a revelation to him at his young age.
Sure.
And he had a bucket full of them, and he came home. He was so upset. He said, "I had those clams, and I was going to bring them home to you, Dad, and a man stopped me and made me pour those clams." He said, "Kid, you put those clams back. That's illegal."
Oh, really? Even
And then
back
later,
Way back then.
yeah, and then later, Drew discovered the conch in the Indian River,
Really?
and queen conch,
Right.
and of course they were ugly. They were full of barnacles.
Sure.
There's not like in the Bahamas,
Yeah.
and they were ugly-looking animals, but they were the queen conch. And he brought 3 of them home, and I had him take them back and release them because they were
really?
so
Yeah.
scarce.
What about the river itself? I mean, we look at this out here even today, and I noticed as we were pulling up to the dock, it sort of looked muddy and all that. Was it really, really different back then? I mean, was it super
Well,
clear or?
We moved to Stewart in 1933. I was 6 years old. We moved on to the St. Lucie River, where the river goes east and west.
Over that way.
Over that way.
Right.
And we looked north across the river to Tucson Hill.
Right.
And the river, the canal had been dug in, I think, 1925 when they opened that.
Right.
So the river was already dirty. It
Oh,
was
okay.
not clear. In fact, it was worse in one respect because it was full of hyacinths. The hyacinths would come out of the lake and the canal and come into the St. Lucie River where the salt water killed them. And you would have rotting hyacinths along the edge. And finally, I think in the 60s, the state, I believe it could have been the federal government, found a way to kill the hyacinths before they got out of the lake into the river.
Right.
And we haven't seen that, but back in those days, the river would just be full of hyacinths.
Yeah.
And
And they would drift up towards the Roosevelt Bridge, and the salt water hit them, and then they would die,
Yeah.
and they would drift out through the inlet. But they were, at one time, it was solid hyacinths from one side of the river to the other side.
So really what you're saying, we've always had a little bit of a problem
Right.
with the river itself.
And on
But it was still far, far better back then than it is now.
but we didn't
Yeah.
have the fungus, whatever that is.
Patrol for snook, we had snook were plentiful then,
Right.
and there was no limit, no size limit, no number limit. And
Any
that,
time of the year you wanted.
yeah, anytime you wanted, and we saw, and then there was a market for them. At one time, they were 10 cents a pound, and then 12 cents a pound, and 14 cents a pound. Then that was it. And then later on, it got better. And
Sure.
we would troll eelskin rigs. We had the eelskin rig like that with a couple of hooks in it, and that was very productive. And we catch the fish, and we caught I shouldn't say it, we caught 500 pounds in one day
Good Lord.
just trolling. And,
I'll be darned.
Told them with hand lines.
With
yeah,
hand
Big
lines.
hard, tarred hand lines. You could pull them in faster.
yeah.
Oh, really?
What sport?
Yeah.
You hauled them in, threw them in the thing, and threw the wheel skin back
I
out.
had little outriggers, bamboo outriggers on either side, and I had a little bell attached to each end. And when you get a strike, it would
Make a little sound?
Make a little sound. And,
Isn't that cheating a little bit?
no, that's smart. And it's raining.
Gentlemen, I really, really appreciate you coming and being on my show. And give
to
us a
be here.
little reminiscence of what it was like back then.
It was
And
it was heaven.
It was fun. Even when I came, it was a lot of fun. I was a young man at the time. So.
It was a great spot to grow up in.
Right, it really,
Believe me.
really, really
It was
was.
a beautiful spot. So.
Well, here we are. Actually, a little melancholy about this because this is probably the last show I'll be doing for MCTV. It's really been a pleasure over the last, 10 years? And we put many environmental programs on. This, by far, is probably the most important because everybody is worried about the river. We need to know how to take care of it, how to keep it so that we can have it for future generations. And so now we've seen actually the way it is now. We know some of the problems that have happened, and we have found out by some of the, I don't want to say old timers, but some of the people that have lived here for many, many years told us about what it was like back then. So this really is Fred Berkey, Farmer Fred, saying goodbye and thank you for watching.